Welcome to NRI Pulse. We have with us today Daniel Blackman, who is running for election to the Georgia Public Service Commission to represent District 4. In 2016, he became the first African American to run for the office in Forsyth County and was the 2014 Democratic nominee for Georgia's Public Service Commission. His professional experience includes working as an executive director for a nonprofit and as a speaker and author. He serves as a board member at the Georgia ACLU. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm very, very pleased to be here today.
Wonderful. You are an activist committed to fighting for environmental justice, public health, and political empowerment. So how does this passion sort of translate into, your policy making decisions? Like, let's say, a decision such as, if cost should be a factor to determine what energy resources utilities use, or, should the goals be like cleaner air and, sort of reduced carbon emission, things like that?
I think reduced carbon emissions, clean air, and clean water, which we so fundamentally take for granted, which is one of the reasons I ran for this position. I've had a chance to travel internationally in the Middle East and in Europe. My family is from the Caribbean. My grandfather served as diplomat to the United Nations from Barbados. So I have a very extensive history of working in the international community. And I believe that the United States, being one of the top global emitters and, we're what 1/5 of the global population, if that, but we are, we commit up to a quarter, if not more, to the global impact on waste and on pollution. And when you look at countries like the United States and China, and you look at what is happening globally and the decisions that we have to make politically, we have to take into account the access to clean water and clean air that we're not really considering our impact on. So as a climate activist and as an environmental justice advocate, I work very hard to make sure that we bring these issues up in our policymaking process, but also as we work with communities that are, I'd say, regionally different and diverse, whether it's the Pacific Islander community or the South Asian community or the Caribbean community. We have to understand that every community is different and shares different values, and we hope to work to understand that better, to implement better policies.
Georgia lawmakers are proposing a new tax on phone lines, TV subscriptions, and maybe even, internet streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime. What are your thoughts about that?
Say the last part of your question again. I heard you say cable. Can you repeat the last part? You said.
Basically, Georgia lawmakers are proposing a new tax on phone lines and TV subscriptions and maybe even internet streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime. So what are your thoughts about that?
Totally against it. We have already put a tremendous burden on consumers. Georgia has amongst the highest rates in the United States from a utility standpoint. We're not even talking about internet access at this time, which in Georgia, we have 10.2 million residents, but 1.9 million Georgians are living at or below the poverty line. The hardest hit communities are communities that live in adverse poverty, areas outside the metro Atlanta area where young men and women who are working hard to get their education virtually don't have consistent access to the internet. And we have to fundamentally change that. If we're going to begin to change that narrative, we have to work to make sure that we protect the pocketbooks of consumers and ratepayers. And let's be honest, utility companies for the past several decades have made a tremendous amount of money. If you look at what COVID-19 has done right now, this is the wrong time to be having a conversation about adding a tax on streaming services or on any utilities when we've already seen a burden. One example I'll give is in the United States, on average, the average paycheck for the average American is about 5 to 6% of their paycheck goes to paying their utility bill. In Georgia, we're paying 18 to 22% of our paycheck towards our utility bill. This includes gas, electric, cable. So what do we do when folks on a fixed income or the unemployed or the underemployed are hit with these multiple taxes that further keep them in poverty and impact their pocketbooks. So I'm totally against any new taxes that would burden working families and seniors on a fixed income.
Um, the ongoing shift, well, I guess this is also sort of the same thing. Basically, it's about, the ongoing shift to remote work, will eventually drive demands for networking infrastructure and connectivity. So, how does, however, the demand could also strain business owners. And as you know, a lot of the Indian Americans are business owners and startups too. So, does the Office of the Public Service Commission have any plans to address these issues?
We don't have a choice. Currently, I'm a candidate. I'm not elected to the PSC, but in Forsyth County, for example, we have one of the fastest growing Indian populations in the United States. We have to begin to think about how those communities interact. And one part of my background is driving technology investments in Silicon Valley and around the United States when it in regards to startups. So if you look at startups and the burden that we're seeing right now, for example, you just mentioned streaming media. When you talk about streaming services, teleworking, telecommuting, telemedicine, we have to have the infrastructure in place to support that. But then we also have to consider in our minority contracting opportunities, the opportunities for the Indian community, the Asian community, the Latino community, the Black community. We're not doing enough to drive investment. And what I mean by that is you and I both know that startups are the hallmark and the backbone of our society and our economy. If we're not looking at these businesses, that many of them which are run in Silicon Valley, the difference in Georgia and California as it relates to this is the type of investments that are made to support these growing communities and their infrastructure. So we have to rethink what we're doing in Georgia, especially since infrastructure is so critical. I am a big proponent of one, expanding our infrastructure so that the travel and the whether it's through light rail or bus, we have to do a better job of that. But keep in mind that the Public Service Commission's responsibility and role has nothing to do with transportation. But what I believe is in this capacity, we have to drive that investment. We also have to make sure that utility companies take into consideration the types of infrastructure reform and adjustments they're going to have to make over the next several decades. And if you think about it, what happens when states like Georgia have an increased capacity on autonomous driving, right? Now, when we begin to see things begin to be automated at higher levels, we're going to have to rethink energy, not just the way we generate energy, but the way our energy impacts our daily work, our lives, our commuting, and our ability to be able to be productive at home. And I think you and I would both agree that that India as a whole, when you look at India, when you look at South Asia, when you look at the Caribbean, many of the call centers and the telecommunication spaces come from these places that many individuals are not only underserved and really, in my opinion, not invested into adequately. But when we have these pockets and these growing populations in states like Georgia, we have to make sure our utility practices and our investments for clean energy are in alignment so that opportunities exist for small business owners, but also for those who are at work that are wanting to be entrepreneurs, startups, and executives that deal within the technology industries.
Um, Two new nuclear reactors under construction at Plant Vogtle.
That's
Are
right.
yes, you're over budget and years behind schedule. And Georgia families, small businesses, cities, and schools are really paying dearly for that. So, what
and
is
and our interfaith community with our mosques, churches, and synagogues as well,
yeah,
and temples.
yes. So, how do you, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the honest to God truth is that we can't reverse what has already been done. Plant Vogtle is one of the most fiscally irresponsible decisions in the history of the state of Georgia. It's currently sitting at around $30 billion. So when you talk about it being, over budget and past schedule, we have to think about what are the alternate impacts that we're going to see on our society. We could have been investing that same billions of dollars into energy infrastructure, into wireless broadband, into access to internet, high-speed internet, accessibility for communities that are not as wired. So one, when I think of Plant Vogtle, there's nothing we can do to reverse the decisions that have been made. That's the first part. Number two, we have to now hold the utility companies, Georgia Power, case in point, more accountable because their shareholders have not been heard. Their ratepayers have. So the ratepayers in the state of Georgia are taking on the burden. And you mentioned it amazingly when you said the small businesses, they're fitting the bill. Our schools, they're fitting the bill. Schools are paying upwards of $10,000 to $15,000 to be paying over the last several years to be paying for this. Individuals are paying around $9 to $10 a month, which means over a year's time, they're paying about $120 over a 10-year period. They're paying almost $1,200 for struggling working families. So the three things that I want to see happen is, one, we need to rethink and listen to the staff of the Public Service Commission, which has made recommendations on how to shift some of the burden back to the utility companies and not to the ratepayers. That's number one. The way we do that is working with elected officials, the House representatives and state senators in Georgia that can help us to craft legislation and policy that will allow that burden to be reverted from the ratepayer and the consumer to the utility company and the shareholder. Number two, we've got to rethink our investment in energy infrastructure. We have overinvested into fossil fuels and underinvested into clean technology. When I say clean technology, I don't just mean the technology from an aspect of solar panels and biofuels and wind turbines. I also mean our ability to secure our grid and invest in a grid that is not only sustainable, but that can take on extreme weather, whether it's hurricanes or the threat of tornadoes. We need to make sure our infrastructure is in place to build that type of work. And then lastly, I would like to see, and this is a little more of an ambitious idea that I have, I would like to see some of those expenses reverted to education. We have in communities around the country, the South Asian community and the Indian community and many communities that are international, they're raising their children to go into the technology spaces. But our schools and our technical colleges do not reflect that. I would like to see a tremendously significant amount or a portion of what has been spent to be turned back into the educational system so that in our K through 12 education, we can begin to train young men and women for the workforce that's going to be needed for us to sustain a clean energy workforce. The problem is when you look at colleges like Georgia Tech, and I'll be really quick, when you look at Georgia Tech, about 68% of the students that graduate from there leave the state of Georgia. Why? Because their skill set, their degree, and their aspirations cannot be maintained in Georgia. So they go to Silicon Valley, they go to London, they go to their home countries because the opportunities are not here to fit the degree and the investment that their families have made into their careers. We have to begin to train a workforce and develop a workforce specifically in high school and middle school that can then translate into jobs once they leave, whether they want to go into technical jobs or they want to pursue a college degree that can then translate into clean energy jobs that will build the workforce we need to build out and not be indebted to projects like Plant Vogtle, which we'll be paying for the next 60 years.
And a very good ambition too. Okay, so now, how can Georgia Public Service Commission sort of encourage investment in and sort of adoption of clean energy like solar, wind, any other renewable like zero to low carbon resources?
Well, we have to drive public and private investment. What we've done a very poor job of doing is thinking that the relationship between the utility companies and the PSC is the most sustainable relationship. We have to remember there's a line in the sand. The PSC is not an arm of the utility companies. It's the regulatory body to make sure they're doing the right thing while providing safe and reliable energy. So what we need to do is my background, for example, in working with Goldman Sachs, for example, which has committed over $500 billion over a 10-year period to combat climate change and to invest into clean energy technology. Why aren't we working to drive those public and private partnerships locally so that we can begin to expand the investment? I don't want the government to give a subsidy or a program that we have to base our growth on solely. I believe we can offer incentives to businesses. I believe we can subsidize what consumers do on their own. But here's the bigger part. If we rely on those two alone, we won't be able to make the type of strides we want to go into the future. But if we begin to drive the investments of private companies, family offices, and investments from around the country, we can then create this space in Georgia where manufacturing can be increased, technology can be increased, research and development can be increased in colleges like Georgia Tech, Savannah State University, which is a historically black college, and also Georgia Southern, which is on the coastal line. We can maybe invest into clean tech, such as wind technology off the coast of Georgia. So I think we need to rethink the way in which we want to drive an investment into our state so that we can build a more robust and advanced state that can compete with other places. Like, look at what Germany did. Germany has invested heavily into solar and renewables, and as a result, it's paid off. If we're not making aggressive strides towards a clean energy future, we're going to be left behind. I don't think we can afford to do that.
Next year, the PSC will adopt Georgia Power's Integrated Resource Plan.
That's right.
What will you be looking for from the utility in its plan?
I mean, it's really simple. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this answer because, one, most people don't know. An integrated resources plan basically is the outlook on the way in which Georgia Power will generate their power over the next several years. We need to do one very basic thing: make sure that they have a diverse mix of clean energy. We've been too heavily relied on coal and on fossil fuels. I would like to see Georgia Power give us a realistic plan, not a plan that goes all the way out to 2050. I want to see a plan that in the next 3 to 5 years, what are the aggressive things we're doing right now? Because let's be honest, if you think about who's being affected the most, it's minority communities, communities that are facing increased challenges with respiratory illness, asthma, senior citizens that are facing respiratory illness. We're seeing marginalized communities impacted the most. So we need to see our power companies, whether it's an EMC or it's Georgia Power or it's Atlanta Gas and Light, we need to begin to see plans that show us how we can transform the future and not be left in the past. When their integrated resources plan is released, I'm going to be looking, especially with the Vogel monitoring report, because you just mentioned Plan Vogel. We've got to look at what changes they've made, how they face the challenges, how we're going to be able to deal with threats. For instance, we have a presidential election coming up in the next 34 days. Well, what happens when countries like China or Russia or any other country has a cyber attack? Are we putting the infrastructure in place now to be able to deal with those things that are coming against us? So this integrated resources plan, not to venture too far off, I know I gave a separate answer over there, but the IRP needs to really show and explain to us how we're going to be able to rely more on clean energy sources that can be protected against cyber attack or the threat thereof, but also make sure that we understand how we're going to transition to the power we currently use into power that is not only a better investment, but offers us a better opportunity for our commission and for the state of Georgia.
Now, the Georgia Public Service Commission is one of the most impactful yet overlooked state agencies. So what would you as a commissioner do to increase awareness about the role of PSC, its duties, and sort of the decisions that it makes?
So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create this. We're going to treat the state of Georgia in our first 100 days as four regions: North, South, East, and West. We want to separate those regions and have 2 times a year. We want to have something that I'd like to call the Institute of Public Utilities. We want to make sure that we're communicating with religious leaders, interfaith leaders, civic leaders, school leaders, local government officials, and we want to bring people together for 2 days. So imagine 2 days twice a year, 4 days per region, where we come in and we give a full day course, not only on the utility regulation process, but on how to advocate to your elected officials. The Public Service Commission needs to do more town halls. We need to communicate more. There needs to be more transparency. When I'm elected to the Public Service Commission, I will have an open list so that people can see who I'm communicating with. I think that there are too many secret meetings that are happening with our commissioners and with the individuals in which they regulate. So we need to do a better job of educating people in and out of an election season. We do a great job of talking about it as individuals when we're given the stage and the platform, but we're not doing a good enough job when we're not on the ballot. And people like myself have to make sure people understand, what does climate change mean as it relates to the emissions, right? What does it mean that when coal ash seeps into our water, like in Juliet, Georgia? What does it mean when we have high levels of mercury and lead in our waters? What does it mean when the power in which we generate, to your question earlier about emissions, we need to understand that. When we understand that and when we're planning for it, we put ourselves in a position where people now have more of an interest because they understand three things. One, how their public health is affected. Two, how their pocketbooks are affected. And three, as my grandfather, when he was with the United Nations, reported in a sustainable goal and plan, it said we're well able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We are currently compromising the ability of this generation to be able to live a sustainable future. And in cultures around the world, we understand that if we're not thinking about the other generations that are going to come after us, then we're going to totally miss the point. We don't inherit the planet from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And we have to give our children the kind of environment that will allow them to perform and produce and to sustain themselves for the next several years of their lives, and so they can build their families as well. So we have to educate the community, but also our schools, K through 12, and make sure the right people are at the table to make the policies that support our ideologies.
More and more Indian Americans, I like, for example, Uma actually gave me your number. So more and more Indian Americans are coming out in support of you. And we haven't seen that in the past. I've been here, so that's surprising. So I want to know, what do you know about these people and the culture?
Yeah, so where I live, we have a very fast growing Indian population, and we have our schools have increasingly become diverse. So I've sat down with the parents and the families, and I understand the importance of education in our communities. And that's why one of the reasons why I adjusted my platform, if you look at my website, I have a space called Creating a Workforce of the Future. I believe that when we have families that are coming here from other countries, they're not coming here because they're trying to, get something and leave. They're building their families and raising their children in places where they want them to be able to compete globally. So my perspective on what we have been able to accomplish as a candidate is to make sure that we're placing a heavy emphasis on education. And I want you to think about that for a second. I'm not running for education secretary. I'm not running for superintendent. I'm running for a position that deals with utility regulation, but I understand fundamentally workforce development and communities that come from other countries like my own. I'm first generation. My mother and father came from Barbados. As I mentioned, my grandfather served the United Nations, so he was here in the 70s, but my family was here and had to learn a totally new culture without having to give up their culture, their beliefs, and their values. So I've built a campaign based upon being one, sensitive to the differences that we have that make us unique, but also making sure that we place an emphasis on education, which is why many families that are here decide to be so rigorous when it comes to their children. We have done a poor job, not just as Democrats, not just as Republicans, but as society in the United States on the emphasis on education. And you just asked it. You said, what is it that we can do to educate more people that don't know or aren't as aware about the Public Service Commission? Why aren't they aware? Because we failed to teach this in civics. We failed to teach this in K through 12 education. So as a commissioner, I am not going to be getting paid to do regional educational spaces. I'm not going to be taking a honorarium to go into schools. I have three children I'm raising. And I believe that if I'm able to build infrastructure for families like yours and the other ones that are going to be voting for me, then it's incumbent for me to make sure that we're doing it in a way that allows us to provide the same opportunities for kids, no matter what their zip code is, where they live, what their background is, and what differences they may have. So I am very committed to the plight of those who live here that share some differences that really make us unique. What makes America great is not our political power, it's not our military power, it's the power of our diversity and investing into the diverse communities that make us a better society for everyone.
My final question was going to be, why should the community vote for you? I guess you can answer that.
Yeah, I'll say it really simple. I didn't want to run for Public Service Commission this year. What I wanted to do this year was I wanted to help impact the presidential election. But what I learned in working to impact that area was that there were so many people that weren't excited about going all the way down the ballot. And as you know, all politics is local. We can talk about the presidential election all we want, but if we're not talking about our East Indian population in Forsyth County and Gwinnett County, if we're not talking about our Caribbean population in Stone Mountain, if we're not talking about our populations of Brazilian, Afro-Brazilians and Brazilian Americans, if we're not talking about these communities, then what they're going to do is they're going to vote for president if they vote at all, and then they're going to go home. They're not going to vote for judges. They're not going to vote for the county commission, which drives investment. They're not going to look at the school board races. They're not going to look at the House or Senate races. And they're not realizing that in their inactivity and their unwillingness to be involved in the political process, whether it's through the census or it's through voting for House and Senate representatives, what happens at that point is we now have an unbalanced system that unfairly has an impact and unequally has an impact on our community. So people should vote for someone that believes in educating our community, not just being a candidate that's going to disappear. This is a 6-year term. I believe in my first 2 years, I will have not only increased the educational capacity of individuals to know about the Public Service Commission, but I believe that we can really work with school systems. There are 159 counties in Georgia. I want to make sure that within the first 2 years, at least 50 of those counties have spaces where we can drive education in technology and utility regulation. Why? Because in some of these poor communities, they're being left behind because they don't have access to information and education. So if you want a candidate that's going to go and represent you that you're not going to hear from, I'm not your guy. But if you want someone that's going to go to the Public Service Commission, that's going to pick up the phone, that's going to come in the communities, even when look, if I come into a community and I happen to be the only African American in the community, that's okay. As long as we can communicate and we can understand how to translate those challenges and those opportunities, I'm okay with that, because I'm not going to be someone that's going to be one-sided. I believe that we have to look at the entirety of our state. We have to look at the future of our children collectively, and we have to have individuals that don't get elected to put it on their resume. They get elected to make sure that they're driving the conversation, representing people's voices that are not being heard, and that drive the investments that you talked about earlier for our small businesses, our communities, the diversity of what makes us strong, but lastly, for our children who don't have a voice and who have been left behind. We as a state cannot afford at any elected position to leave another county or child behind. We have done it too often, and our investment into our future is in our best and our greatest natural resource, which is our families and our children. And I plan to be a fearless voice and advocate that will never take money from the individuals he regulates. And I also will make a commitment right now on your show that I will be accessible, because when you get elected, you shouldn't disappear. People should know how to reach you at every time, especially in their time of need. So I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I hope to make sure that we host a series of town halls once I'm elected that can continue to drive this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing that.
Oh, it's an honor. It's an honor. And I would love to come back on before the election and let you know what we're hearing and what we're doing. And we'll continue to work very hard to keep up with what we've talked about today. So thank you so much. I'm honored.
Thank you.